Do you enjoy those mind expanding conversations? I had one of those with Justin McSweeny, the host of the IdeaCast interview series. I was really excited to be interviewed by Justin. He's very intellectual, smart, also relatable, and we talked about all kinds of things from vulnerability and compassion to internal family systems and neuroscience. So here is my conversation with Justin McSweeny from the IdeaCast video series.
And I'd like to welcome Kate King to the IdeaCast interview series. And I welcome all of the YouTube attendees who are watching this conversation. I very much appreciate your company. And Kate, I very much appreciate you being with me today and being in conversation with me because I'm looking forward to it. I did my diligent research. I learned from you and I got new ideas and thoughts coming in. So I'm really excited to talk about that. So welcome to the show and appreciate you coming by today.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here and really excited for our conversation as well.
Yes, I think it'll be fruitful, and especially again to the folks who are watching on YouTube. You've got some practice and modalities and things and aspects of work that I think folks could benefit from. And so those of you in the audience, we will be covering a number of different little bullet points that I've laid out here. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. But before we get into some of the details of what you do and the services you provide, I'm always curious to know maybe what brought somebody to this kind of work, to being sort of the archetype of a sage and a helpful person and somebody who engages in helping people find themselves and transform their lives and so forth. So if you could give us a little background on what brought you to maybe you've been doing this for a while. Well, you have about 15 years of
Yes.
experience. And so what brought you to that initial stage of wanting to learn and get your degrees and certifications? And then, what's the journey been like since then? So we'll ask you to give us a little bit of a background on you.
Sure, happy to. I think I was kind of groomed for this line of work just from my basic temperament and the family system that I was raised in. I was a pretty introspective child,
Mm.
always, very creative, had a lot of imagination, but also just sort of a kind of seriousness about myself. So it was always interesting to me to kind of think about the human mind and relationships and just what makes people tick. And I felt like I was always reading people between the lines and picking up on things that maybe they weren't saying, experiencing different energetics in interpersonal dynamics and within groups that when I was young, I probably didn't really understand. But as I got older and I had a little more say over what I studied in college, it was really easy for me to study both art and psychology because I had such an interest in both. And it was interesting because at the end of junior year, senior year, I was like, what am I going to do with my art and psychology degrees? I have no idea. And so I actually plugged them into Google, like, what do you do with an art and psychology degree? And that's how I first found out about art therapy.
Mm.
And I was then introduced by Google to Naropa University, which is where I went and got my master's in transpersonal counseling, psychology, and art therapy. And that felt like a really beautiful fusion because my work in psychology had also brought me into different realms of spirituality that were non-denominational, not religiously affiliated, but just kind of, the big existential questions of why are we here? Why do we have pain? Why are some people's lives harder than others? Why do we each perceive the world through new lenses? And so transpersonal counseling psychology really looks at the intersection of psyche and spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And then art therapy comes in to create a creative directive that helps to provide an outlet and a processing source for whatever comes up in the work. So with that master's degree, I also got a formal training in meditation, which really allowed me to learn how to hold space for the hard things and be able to have the introspection and that kind of serious quality of really wanting to understand people and extend it beyond myself towards clients and groups, and be able to sit with what they had gone through, their traumas, their experiences, and really hold space for it in a way that I don't know that I would have been able to do without meditation training. And then after grad school, I tried a lot of different, kind of dabbled in different industries in the psychotherapy world, be it a grief house or an inpatient unit for children, or an eating disorder unit. And then I took a lot of that clinical experience and I rolled it into my private practice, where I really specialized for a long time in trauma treatment, different mental health conditions, couples and relationship issues, and just kind of that overall transformational work that's really deep and profound, and helps people to not only have better insight about themselves, but also kind of their place in the world and how they can be healthy and create that ripple effect through and beyond themselves toward other people. So I worked in my private practice for 15 years. And then during the pandemic, just got profoundly burned out, as many healthcare providers did. So I took a sabbatical in the beginning of 2022, where I just was, feeling like there was another chapter coming for me, not really understanding how to apply my skills in a new way. And I spent that time creating what I now own and operate, which is the Radiant Life Project, which my psychotherapy offerings are one offering in the Radiant Life Project, but there's also a more expansive platform of healing that includes different kinds of energy work, retreats, workshops, art-based practices, speaking, and I have a new book coming out called The Radiant Life Project, which is a big masterclass download of all of my experience in sort of a do-it-yourself manual that includes a lot of experiential offerings for people as well. So that's where I'm at. That's my journey.
Wow. And so born of your sabbatical was the idea for the book. This came to be, it was gestating during that sabbatical, or I should say it came into more of a tangible reality during the time that you had taken off to not only form the Radiant Life, but then the book is manifesting itself through
Yes.
that. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow,
and this is
that's
the second book. My first book I wrote 8 years ago. It's called The Authentic Mother, and it was in response to becoming a mother myself and feeling like, gosh, nobody tells you about all this really hard, profound transitional information with motherhood and parenthood in general. So that's an art-based companion book for new parents. So I have the love of writing, and I always have, but during my sabbatical, I kind of got this download like, okay, here's another book that needs to come into the world. And now feels like the time.
okay. And is that in the process of going to be published? Is it forthcoming, or is it already fait accompli and somebody can go order it, or where are
It's
you?
not ready yet. It's not
Okay.
published. The manuscript is complete, and I'm in the process right now of creating book proposals and sending it out to publishers.
Okay. So maybe early next year for folks
Yes,
that are
I hope
watching.
so. I
Okay,
hope
good.
so. Yeah, you
Okay.
can kind of keep tabs on that through my website or my social media. I'll be updating people in the process.
Awesome. And of course, it's a good time to mention that I will have all the links and relevant information to access Kate's work and her social media platforms down in the description field. So stay tuned, and that book will be coming out soon. And as she said, she has Authentic Motherhood. It's available through her website. I believe you can get it on most of the e-retailers, online booksellers, and so forth. So if you're curious, and I hope you are, go and start searching out through those links and discovering her work. And so we will be getting into some of the details and the nuts and bolts of your work, because like I said, after having spent some time researching, there were lots of things that came up that I'd love to chat with you about and get into. And now one question I have from what you had mentioned earlier about your coming of age and you're coming into your profession, with transpersonal psychology, is transpersonal I'll need a definition for that for my own curiosity. Or not, I don't need it, but I would like a definition for my own curiosity. Does it describe sort of beyond ourselves and sort of the universality of humanness, or is it more of an allusion to spirituality, or what are they indicating when they say transpersonal?
Yes, and to
Okay.
your question. So trans means beyond, and
Mhm.
personal is the self.
Okay.
So it's basically a lens of psychology that sees the self as not all that there is, right? Like we're not the sun that every other planet orbits. We are part of something that is embodied and expansive. And so transpersonal psychology allows there to be just sort of access to the multidimensionality of human experience through a spiritual lens, but also grounded in different scientific practices.
Okay.
So some of the sort of non-traditional psychology and practices like Dr. Joe Dispenza's work would fall under transpersonal counseling psychology. Also, Jungian archetypal work is transpersonal. Stan and Christina Groff talk about different kinds of birth trauma that relates to lives that we may have had before this life that create mental health issues or issues in this life. So there's just a lot of dimensionality and expansiveness in understanding why we are the way we are and our growth potential as human beings. And it's actually really adaptable. If people do have religious affiliations, it can adapt and fit into that. If people have really big, profound questions, it can be, as, expansive as people want it to be, but it's really not, it's not the kind of psychology that says, this is how it is, and that's it, period. It's really a lot more open.
Okay. It reminds me of one of the aspects of Frankel's logotherapy, where he talks about, and I forget the term, but it's basically taking your attention away from yourself and sort of seeing the other, or seeing the otherness beyond the self, and that seems to resonate too.
Yeah.
With
And
that.
there's a kind of mirror perspective too, that we are all projective creatures and the world is mirrors. Relationships are mirrors. So we're just bouncing our projections off of each other. And so although I'm a me and you are a you, and maybe on some quantum dimension, we're made of the same stuff, we're actually here to foster and facilitate each other's growth through the perception of each of our own identity as a self.
I have a philosopher that I follow, and he likes to joke that we're kind of like Mars rovers, and we are just sort of gathering information and doing it as we fumble our way through alien terrain. So that's my kind of weird way of trying to understand what it is that we're doing and things like that.
It makes sense.
Yeah, he goes a little, he actually has a beautiful analogy. And so it's things like Rupert Spira talks about it, and it's like there's nothing to the whirlpool but the water itself. That's the way to talk about a simultaneity of unitary oneness, but at the same time individual expression of just this breaking away from the oneness kind of thing, whereas you are you and I am me, that kind of thing. So anyway, but they love to have all these beautiful metaphors and analogies for these things, and it's funny to bring them up. And but so okay, thank you for describing transpersonal for the sake of, for me, as well as for those who might be curious and drawn to that idea. So in the Radiant Life, I believe in one of your, and to those watching on YouTube, Kate has an excellent YouTube channel, and again, links below, and wonderful conversations, dialogues with other people. You did a huge healer series, and you also have monologues where you talk to people directly. And one of the monologues that you had, you were talking about the 3 pillars of a radiant life. So maybe we could segue into your work by talking about, first of all, I guess maybe describe what the radiant life is, and then maybe then go into further into what the 3 pillars, if that sounds good. Can we start with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Radiant Life Project was really built from my experience of, trying to figure out where my burnout came from before my sabbatical, and trying to understand, like, gosh, why is something that used to feel so generative for me suddenly feeling exhausting? This can't be good for my clients, and it can't be good for me, right? So I feel like there's definitely there was that need to sever work and to have space to experience. And what I realized was that it was the stuckness that people would experience in therapy. And as I talked with my other colleagues, as I was moving through my sabbatical, they reflected similar issues in their practices as well, that sometimes people come to therapy and it ends up being this kind of rumination process where it's just a dog chasing its tail kind of, or, chasing the proverbial carrot that never gets you anywhere. And so the Radiant Life Project is really built off of fostering forward movement and growth, where we honor our history and our trauma, and we don't live there. We learn how to move beyond that pain and integrate it in really meaningful ways into the fabric of our being, so that it actually strengthens and helps us grow who we are, rather than limiting who we are because we're stuck in the mud, right? And so I just feel like that was, that's a really important perspective for me, just to remember and to hold. And so the Radiant Life Project, I call it a project because it's fundamentally like the project of self. We are constantly working, we are constantly growing who we are. And so the more we can be in focus of the most important project that will ever be, which is the project of self-development, the more we really respect that we don't have to be like perfect at any point in time, where there's really no there to get to. It truly is just the constant work of, the moment and where we're at, right? So I think that's a really big, important piece.
Okay. And you had mentioned there were, I think, the three pillars of a radiant life. So are there techniques or approaches to cultivate this and to prevent circularity or dog tail chasing and things like that?
Yes.
So these are mechanisms or means by which
Yes.
you
So
can move forward.
The three pillars of a radiant life are authentic integrity, which is being really honest about who you actually are and living from that place with such integrity to who I am, not who I think I'm supposed to be or who other people tell me I'm supposed to be, but really honoring who I am and what's real for me in the me that I am now, which may not even be the me that I was last week, right? So authentic integrity is keeping kind of a constant pulse on what's real in the moment, and then behaving with that alignment and with absolute integrity to that. So that's the first pillar. The second is aligned relationships. So this is crucial because so many people end up either in partnerships, marriages, friendships, work relationships that they're like, yeah, it's not great. It doesn't feel good. It really drains me, but I don't know how to get out of it. And it's important that we understand that relationships can expire, and relationships have the capacity to really be generative and nourishing in our lives. And they also have the capacity to be incredibly draining and toxic. And it's not that that person is bad or that there's something wrong. It's just a matter of misalignment. And so I talk a lot about finding congruity and alignment in relationships. And that's the second pillar.
Okay.
And then the third pillar is creativity. And it doesn't have to be through a lens of art or art therapy. It can be through the perspective that whatever you do in your life, whether it's, a creative or a technological or a business, finance, whatever it is, we can put creativity into all that we do. You can put creativity into the way you make your dinner, right? But living with creativity is really important for the nourishment of our soul and for the very, humanness that we are. Our ancestors were making art with bones and mud, on cave walls before they really even had the cognitive abilities that we have today. So it's part of our DNA to be creative. And a lot of people say like, well, I can't draw, and so I'm not a creative person. And then they just sever their connection to that energy of the creative divine. So that's the third pillar of a radiant life.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that it's the will to create, I guess maybe could be a a good base way to say it is inherent within us. It's been multi-generational, like you said, for 50,000 years ago they were doing cave paintings and things like that. So it's within us, and it also, I think, it has a great meaning to it. It's expressive, it's communicative, it's mimetic, it's, you know, it's all these things that we recognize. There's a relation that goes on, I think, when somebody creates something artistic. And of course there's variability in that, and so some things are salient, other things may not be. Some art, obviously, as they say, art is subjective. What's your thought, this is kind of off the wall, but when you were saying what you were saying about the historical nature of our creativity, have we entered into an era of kind of like fast food creativity? And I say fast food in the sense like fast creativity, where maybe we were at a sweet spot in the 20th century or before, where art was slow and art was more immersive. Or is it good that technology and the immediacy of, say, stuff online or virtual reality or things like that are just taking us into a new frontier of artistic creativity? What's your thoughts on where we are today with, and I ask you as an art major, I mean, where do you think art is right now with sort of the masses, the aggregate population as a whole of humanity?
That's such an interesting question. And, you know, when I think of things on the value judgment scale of, is it good, is it bad, is it better, is it worse? I think it just is. And I think along with the evolution of humanity has been the evolution of creativity. And the way that we perceive creativity has changed as our worlds change, because it has to, because, you know, the art of the great masters, we're not in that world anymore. And so if we tried to create or even appreciate art in that same way, it wouldn't work, because we have this sort of fast-paced life now, and everything is just very instant gratification. And so I think it's really adaptive that we've learned how to make YouTube videos. We've learned how to, you know, create video games and algorithms and all of these different kinds of creativity that the great masters didn't have access to, because technology has granted us such expansive possibility for creativity. But I really think the important piece is not necessarily, you know, which is better, which is worse, but more, how do we use the opportunities that are in front of us in the generation that we were born into? Because there are many people even now with all these different creative portals that they could walk through, they don't, right? They're paralyzed. Maybe it's overwhelming, or maybe they don't feel, I'm not creative, so I'm not going to even try, right? And so I can see how it sometimes, you know, creates a pressure on people where there's too many people on the internet. I don't want people to see something that's not perfect or fully developed. And so I really encourage people to move past that and just create, just make stuff, because your soul needs you to.
Yeah, again, it's so inherent within us, and I think it's a huge aspect of communication. And as a person I follow on YouTube says that even psychotherapy is serious play, and I would take art not just as therapy, but art as expression to be serious play. So there's play where you get on a bungee cord and you get on a zip line, or you jump from a plane or whatever. That's kind of the thrill jockey play. But I also think that, you know, like what you do is serious play. You're getting people to open up and run through scenarios, both, you know, reimagining the past or revisiting the past and imagining a better future. But I also think art would qualify in any of its forms or modality. So modality in the sense of whether it's electronic digital art or if it's something that you get on a canvas, is that type of serious play. But it is a very necessary play, I guess, for expression, right? To get that positive valence and feel that sense of an extension of yourself that you can express. So good. That I'm glad to get your insight on that, because sometimes I worry that you know, with the digitization of everything and us becoming more and more plugged in, you know, it is the more tactile 3D kind of hands-on clay and paint and things like that. I guess, like you said, it's a matter of either availability and accessibility, or, you know, taste, right? There's a lot of options there.
It's all about just the evolution, right? That
Hmm.
if we can keep pace with the way humanity evolves and continue to find new ways to be creative, then, just like water creatures learning how to walk on land, we do the same with art. We have paint and clay creatures learning how to digitize and, create in this new way. And it's exciting.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I'll confess I have a little what do you call it, virtual reality set back there, that computer right there. So I dabble in that and I see such potential in it. Virtual reality didn't quite take off, I don't think, the way they wanted it to, and augmented reality might have more utility to it. But I think there's going to be a renaissance in virtual reality, especially after coming out of the pandemic and people having to be cloistered and sequestering themselves into their homes. I hope for the future that with the right content creators and the right developers coming up and integrating with artists and integrating with really creative people who have visions that I couldn't begin to, I wouldn't know what to offer out as an idea, but just to develop things that are so engaging and so immersive. Because I think one of the nice things about VR is it's a sensory capture, and it takes your visual senses, it takes audio senses, and it could even be somatic in the future where you could have suits on, or like they do with flight simulation where you're moving a little bit, to
Mhm.
really sort of harness an ability to express ourselves in ways that we haven't even thought of. And that would fall, I guess, under that digital art format. So it's more passive, perhaps, that like you're not creating, but that you are nonetheless having uh, probably the same affect, I would suspect,
Right.
in the creative process, because some of it could be very spontaneous. I often brag about this one person who just got her doctoral PhD in computer engineering at FIT, and she developed a virtual reality app or program or system that simulates psychokinesis. So you have your stuff on, your goggles and everything, and you can literally like levitate things just because your brainwave states. She has
Yeah.
you wired into squibs or whatever, and things can levitate. You can make walls disappear. You can do all these kind of things without touching anything. You're just sitting there, and it's that sort of integrated real-time reaction. So again, things like that, I'm like, oh my goodness, that could be such a interesting future, I guess. So anyway, we'll see
There's
what.
no limit. I feel like
Ah,
we live in a world where there's no ceiling. And I think we only limit ourselves by telling ourselves what's impossible,
mhm.
but I just can't think of anything that
Yeah,
is impossible.
amen, amen. And so I don't. I, we could talk about all the. I have to discipline myself as a host here, and so I'm going to ask you about something that I think is really neat in your work, and that was the oh goodness, I've already forgotten. It's the internal family systems. Is that what it is?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I didn't have it in my notes, but that I found very fascinating in the sense, and you almost see it in parody online. Sometimes you'll have the people with a committee of themselves talking at a table, and there's the neurotic self, there's this self and that self. And I also, when I first heard you talking about it, I thought of I don't know who the developer was or the person who came up with the constellation therapy, but I know Peter Levine really took and ran with constellation therapy, which is literally the radiation of the family outward. But I
Yes.
love the fact that you are this sort of maybe a vector point, and then there's the inward, which is what the interior family system, or is it internal family systems? Am I
Yes.
saying that correct? Okay, so I love the duality there, that you can work on the constellation, and I'll let you set that up to do it better justice than I could ever do it. So internal family systems. Let's talk about that for a moment.
So, internal family systems is a therapeutic modality that was created by Richard Schwartz, and it's the differentiation of self and parts. So, a lot of the time, it is sort of simplified into being called parts work. So, you will hear people outside of therapy everywhere saying, part of me wants to go, part of me wants to stay, part of me really doesn't like that. So we talk in parts all the time. But then sometimes when we introduce this model of therapy to people, they immediately say, like, Oh, I don't have multiple personality disorder. Like, it's not, these are not alter egos. This is something that is natural. It's about the multifaceted capacity of the human psyche, and it's normal for all of us. And it's an assumption in internal family systems that we all have self and we all
Mhm.
have parts. And so our dysfunction and the difficulty that arises is when we're living our life from the perspective of a part instead of the perspective of a self. So I'll give you an example of this. So something that's really common is anxiety. So people, may have an anxious part of me feels really anxious today. So if they allow themselves to be flooded by this anxious part, and the anxious part feels like, this is who I am anxious, then it does the system such a disservice, because you forget that your anxiety is just part of you. It's not all of you, and it certainly isn't your true self. It's a facet of who you can become when you're triggered in certain ways, or when your environment reflects certain stimuli that kind of amps you up. So if you're living from that anxious part, then just like looking through a colored lens, everything in the world is going to look anxious to you, and it's going to kind of engage a feedback loop of anxiety. Whereas if you can see that anxious part as part of you, but not all of you, and you can see it from the self perspective, then you allow enough space to remind yourself, this isn't all of who I am. And in
Mm.
fact, this part might be really adaptive. Perhaps I feel anxiety because whatever's happening now is familiar. And this part saved me 5, 10, 30 years ago by letting me feel anxiety and getting away from that thing that felt unsafe. Right. And so self can start to see these parts with compassion, with curiosity, clarity, creativity. There's 8 C's of self, and they're all these really present and kind perspectives toward our parts, because there are no bad parts. All of our parts that have fragmented off from self at different times in our life in response to our environment, they're all trying their best to keep us safe in the world, which can sometimes feel really scary. And so if we think of our parts as little messengers that pop up and say like, "Ooh, this feels really unsafe. We should do our perfectionism thing now." That always works. Or,
Yeah.
"Gosh, this feels, really overwhelming. We should do our sloth thing," because that really works. So you can see how our parts are really adaptive, but they're
Mm.
not actually all of who we are. So the point isn't to live from self all the time, because it's not possible. The point is to notice when you've been swept away by a part, and then actively return to self so that you can reintegrate that part with harmony and balance in the system, and potentially even unburden that part and help it unblend from some of that over identification that it's been carrying, so that it can have a new function in the system. And just like we update our computers, we can update our systems where we say, yeah, that thing that worked when I was 3 years old, it's not applicable anymore. I don't need to do that anymore. You can function differently now that I am, the age that I am, and I have better resources.
Okay. And so it's kind of the plural of persona. Would that be correct in saying that sort of, the persona that we um, portray to the world, or that we project to the world, that there is a plurality to it, and that it's multi-aspectual or faceted? And so, and I love how you said some people might get defensive and say, well, I don't have any kind of, dissociative identity disorder or anything like that, which, it's, we all have to dissociate sometimes. And I think this is a good example of that, to explicate that we do need different us's front and center for different occasions. And so that's why I throw out the idea of the persona, because I'm a different person around certain people. Like if I get around a bunch of brutish males who are into, hunting and caveman type thing, I'm not going to sit there and go, guys, we really need to think about the abstraction of the social normatives and the constructs of all of this type of behavioral performative. They would just look at me and just start, using sentence enhancers that hurt,
Right.
or if I'm with a bunch of people who really do want to think of those kind of things, I'm not going to be like, hey, let's go, blow something up or run something over, not a living creature, of course, but something, just go do something violent and have fun. So I'm being silly, but I think maybe for the sake of trying to say, this is normal, that we behave differently around different people. When I'm with my partner, I'm just kind of, we're both quiet and chill, and we don't have to show off for each other or do anything. Just kind of sit there and chat about whatever's on our minds. But yeah, I'm different around different people, and not drastically, but again, just
Yeah.
depending on the crowd. So it makes sense, and that's what I love about it. And so it's much deeper than what I'm trying to portray here by just being a different person around people. But I really love that internal family systems approach to seeing who we are. And so I would ask you then, how would someone, and this is probably an impossible answer, but how would someone see the neutral self, or just the beingness of self, without any of the constructs, any of the layers or functionality engaged? So how would you define just the self, like
Yeah, actually, internal family systems has a definition for that.
right.
So, and internal family systems calls it self energy.
Okay.
So, a lot of this work is embodiment work. This is not the monkey mind. This is a felt sense, and self has these 8 C's and 5 P's. And you can Google those, because off the top of my head, I'm not going to remember all of them, but they're all grounded in presence and awareness. So some of the C's are creativity, curiosity, compassion, clarity, confidence, connectedness. Some of the P's are perception, playfulness, presence. So the qualities of self are felt experiences. You know what it feels like in a moment when you're just curious,
Mm-hmm.
right? When normally you might be triggered or you might be judgmental. If you can instead say, I wonder what that's about, or that's so interesting, right? That brings you back to self. And I like to think of it as kind of like a solar system where self is the sun and all the parts are planets that
Okay.
orbit, and sometimes they come right in front of the sun and they block it, and you can't see self. You can only see the part, and the part is like, I'm going to protect you. I'm here with the perfect school, these are the tools, these are the skills, and self is just back here. It's still there. It's like it never goes away. It just gets obscured. And so it's about helping that orbit move away so that you can see self again, where you have that clarity. And so in the body, it just it's like that calm sense of presence, and that just natural curiosity and feeling of connection with self and others that is not present with parts. And some parts, I'll add, are self-like. So like I have a therapist part, right, that shows up and is deeply caring, deeply present, right? But that's not always, it can be true self, but sometimes that part looks a lot like self, but sometimes that part, it's different from self because it has its own agenda of like, I'm going to help, I'm going to fix, I'm going to, you're coming to me for help, where self might just be like, I'm here, but what will be, I trust. And sometimes my therapist part is like, I got to make this person, understand so that they can grow. It has an agenda or a charge. Self doesn't have a charge.
Okay. Okay. And I love the curiosity of the self of wonder. It reminds me of, and I'm sort of like the ultimate agnostic. I'm not attached to anything, but the one metaphysics that I like to torture myself with is called process relational metaphysics, a la Alfred North Whitehead, and very abstruse work. But one of the things he talks about is that the process of sort of the creation of the present moment, the beingness and all that kind of thing, is the lure into the future. And it is the draw, he uses the word the eros, but not in the sense that we would normally use eros as a desire, but so it'd be more of a non human desire. It is more of just the lure, the curiosity of what the next creative moment might be. And he uses these kind of quasi-Platonic forms, as well as perished objects, which are the sort of articles of the past that create the next present moment frame that might come into be. So anyway, it just, when you said that, the curiosity reminded me of that he was intuiting that all of that which comes together to form this present moment snapshot of reality, et cetera, is the lure. It is the curiosity. And so that's where he gets more into spirituality. And he says that whatever you want to call source or creation or whatever it is, it's curious, and it's drawing, it's luring itself forward, and it's a co-creative process. It's bringing itself, and I may not be doing it total justice because again, his work is so mind-numbing, it's hard to really understand, but anyway, so that's kind of that. And so when you talk about the pure self, the self of as essence, I like that it fits with that kind of narrative, I guess, or what he was trying to talk about. So I know it's a bit of a tangent, but
it makes sense.
Yeah,
and there's a deductive process too for identifying self, where if I think I'm in self, if I'm feeling, pretty okay, and I can test that by, if there's anything in my immediate experience, can I actually feel curious about it? Can I feel compassion toward that thing that might be tough to feel compassion for? And if I can't feel curious, if I'm just snap judging about something, then I'm not in self. So that's my litmus test, is if I can feel curiosity and compassion towards something, because those are the two of the 8 C's that apply most for me. They're just my easiest ones to go to. If I can't apply curiosity and compassion in the moment, then I am not in self. And then I can start to inquire, okay, well, if I'm not in self, then which part am I in? And that's the beginning of that, inquiry process of first identifying kind of where you are, and then identifying self and seeing the space you traveled away from self.
Wow. Yeah, that's neat. That's really neat. And again, I just did a thumbnail, cursory kind of exploration of that through you, and I just found it really interesting. And so again, if you're here as a member of the YouTube audience, the C's and the P's are all in Kate's videos. There was one, I think, from late last year that I was listening to yesterday, and you had the diagram, or the chart rather, up. And so again, links will be down below, and in Kate's monologues on her YouTube channel, she really covers a lot of this in depth. And as she said, you can go and look on Google and go to the images category and just find PowerPoints or graphs and things like that. But I would encourage you to check out Kate's YouTube channel, because, and I'm not pitching for her necessarily, I'm just saying this, if your curiosity as self has been stoked, then she does a wonderful job in laying out explanations of all these things in her work in the YouTube format. So it's there and available for you. Now, I know certain people have inspired you, and so we'll go through a couple people one at a time. And again, this was covered in some of the talks that you've had on your YouTube channel. So Dan Siegel comes to mind, and he talks about, he has a number of books out, and I believe he's made a positive impression upon you. And so one of the things I drew up as a note from his work that you are inspired by and work with is the upstairs downstairs mind or brain, I guess. Is it mind, I guess? Yeah. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's the brain. It's the anatomy of the brain. So there has been a depiction of the brain for centuries that is called the triune brain, which is the brain in 3 layers. So the innermost layer is the reptilian brain, which is, our fight or flight, our survival mechanism. And we share that part of the brain with all living creatures. So lizards have it, fish have it. It's how we all breathe, sleep, procreate, stay safe. It's how our basic functioning works. And then the next layer is the mammalian brain, which is common amongst mammals. And that is the more kind of emotional brain that has the capacity for connection. It's why you feel love from your dog, right? Because your dog has this part of the brain too. And then the third layer is the neocortex, which is our higher thinking and analytical. That's exclusive to humans. So in Dan Siegel's upstairs, downstairs brain, he uses it really in kind of a relational behavioral model of understanding when we get dysregulated and when we're triggered, what happens in the brain. So there's actually some neat imagery if you just Google upstairs brain, downstairs brain, that makes it just very simple with a staircase. The downstairs brain is the survival place that we go to when we feel threatened or unsafe or insecure, when we're just not feeling stable. And it's really important that you can't be in the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain at the same time. So the upstairs brain is when you have access to your higher thinking capacity. And so when you think about maybe the example of a couple who's fighting, they might be downstairs brain to downstairs brain, kind of banging up against each other. They're each triggered. Neither one of them feels particularly safe in the moment. They're both really upset. They cannot speak rationally. They cannot see each other's perspectives. All they can do is fight, right? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. These are our nervous system responses to feeling unsafe. So the key is that you want to move to the upstairs brain where you can see each other's perspectives, you can speak rationally, you can think logically, you can even analyze a situation. And so the way that someone will move from the downstairs brain to the upstairs brain is you have to give your brain and thus your body cues that you're safe. So this thing that couples engage in when they're angry at each other, it just perpetuates that something doesn't feel safe until you get so fried that you have to just like walk away, or somebody has an outburst of violence, but it either forced or intentionally, you have to break from the circuit of that kind of just like banging back up against each other's downstairs brain. And somebody needs to go upstairs in their brain by either having a sensory experience that helps them feel safe. So it could be something as simple as wrapping a warm blanket around you and feeling the softness. Sometimes compression, like when you swaddle a baby, helps to actually calm the nervous system. Or having a scent like lavender, having a temperature experience like just washing your hands in warm water, taking a shower. All of these things reset your nervous system and help to teach your body that you are in fact safe. And so when one person gets upstairs in their brain, it's easier for them to help the other person by potentially just offering a hug or deep breathing or giving space so that they can also go to their upstairs brain. And from that place, you can say, I see how you felt that way. Do you see how I felt that way? And this way we can have a reparative conversation.
Does that correlate with the sympathetic parasympathetic response in a way? Okay, because it sounded familiar.
Yes, and the polyvagal theory of the nervous system is my personal favorite for really understanding how we can feel safe in our nervous systems, because really we're just holistic and systemic creatures. So our nervous system can't be calm while our brain is triggered. We're one system.
Right. So when you're working with a client, is there ever a time for them to experience the downstairs brain as a part of the therapy, or is it always that it's best to keep them in the sort of parasympathetic or the if I'm saying that right, the upstairs aspect of generating thoughts and ideas and so forth?
Similar to internal family systems where you can't be in self all the time, you can't be in what polyvagal theory calls ventral vagal all the time, which is that grounded, calm place that feels like self. It's just not possible, right? We were given these different mechanisms by Mother Nature because we actually need them. So we need triggers for danger because it's what perpetuates our safety as a species, right? So I think the key is if you go into a place of being in that sympathetic activated state, or even like the dorsal vagal state, which is the extreme parasympathetic, where you're not calm, you're collapsed and shut down, right? So there are these extreme states of feeling unsafe in the world. And we kind of need those for experiential evidence of what it feels like, because when we learn something from an embodied state, then we can make sense of it in our upstairs brain later, right? But the key is not to get stuck. in any of those places. Just like with IFS, how you don't want to get stuck in a part, you're always trying to return to self. The same thing with the nervous system. You don't want to get stuck in the downstairs brain. That's what happens when people get adrenal fatigue and really deep burnout. It can lead to high blood pressure, cancer, heart disease, all different, medical bodily issues can arise when we get stuck in the downstairs brain, and either that like deep sympathetic fight or flight place or the deep dorsal vagal shutdown place.
Okay. So it's almost this fluidity of you just have to move through things and experiences. And if somebody comes to you with partner or parental trauma, that they may have to go on a deep dive for a little while and do some venting and sort of outletting and things like that, primal screams or whatever it takes, and then maybe they come back up and evaluate what just happened and be like, holy crap, that's been in there for 30 years, and I'm glad I went to rage for just a little bit, and now I can introspect on that or reflect on it, and
right. And connecting back to, you mentioned Peter Levine a little earlier. Peter Levine has a concept called titration, which is really important here. Titrating is basically like dipping your toe in and then dipping your toe out, right? So it's like you expose yourself to the things that feel hard and triggering. You don't dive into them head first, because then you might be destabilized. But if you can like open and step back, and then open a little more, and then step back a little more, you end up building what DBT therapy calls the window of tolerance, which is your ability to tolerate discomfort, right? You don't want to be either hyper aroused or hypo aroused. You want to be in this beautiful little window of tolerance where you can be both challenged and present.
Such a nuanced art.
It really takes a lot of practice, and it's different for every single person. We all have our own system.
I can only imagine. Absolutely. And so moving to another person who I suspect has made an impact on you is Brene Brown, and you had a video on authenticity. And so let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's essential, right? When we want to know the self or be able to occupy that space of perhaps an authentic selfness or active authenticity, which I think is more what the one video that I watched of yours had discussed. But let's talk about authenticity for a little bit.
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things, really, in a culture that wants you to fit a mold and be someone in order to achieve some end. Authenticity is essentially breaking the mold and being who you are in a world that doesn't really understand or support that. But it has a resonance that feels true and real for you. And the relationship with authenticity to resentment is really interesting, because it's kind of like a sandwich. If you're inauthentic, then you become resentful, right? Because you're living your life out of coherence with who you really are. It's not sustainable. And it ultimately really diminishes our life experience if we're not shining our own light into the world. But there's also this experience of other people becoming resentful of you for being authentic, because they want you to be who they want you to be. So in the authentic integrity work of that first pillar of the Radiant Life Project, I teach people how to own and really support their own authenticity, regardless of what other people think, because other people are really invested in our self-abandonment. It works for them when we cave in, or when we say yes to the things that we say yes to. They don't care that it doesn't feel authentic to us. They're getting what they need. And so when someone is really invested in your self-abandonment because it works for them, then we get into the second pillar of the Radiant Life, which is that is not an aligned relationship, right? So authenticity and aligned relationships are like this. Yeah. And Brene Brown's work has been really influential for me in this work. She does a lot, especially her last book, The Atlas of the Heart. She talks a lot about language and how important it is that we have the language to describe who we are and how we feel, so that we can be much more granular with what authenticity looks like in our unique individual flavor. So I really like that book, Atlas of the Heart, because it gives like very logical, linear descriptions of really nuanced emotional states that sometimes are hard to pin down. And her research is incredible. I mean, one of my favorite pieces of Brene Brown's research is that her research shows that joy is the scariest emotion.
I can believe it
Yeah.
because it requires vulnerability, right?
Right.
To
And
be
that's
in
her
joy.
jam. Her jam is all about vulnerability and how vulnerability is a strength, even though it's not really advertised that way culturally.
Right, right. No, if you follow the meme sphere and the marketing world, Madison Avenue, that it's all about machismo or hyperfemininity or any of these sort of exaggerated aspects of ourselves, that as you said, people are looking for you to abandon yourself so that you can be more accommodating or pleasing or whatever it is that they're looking, the supply that they're looking for to get from you. So that
Yeah.
makes perfect sense to be and it's good. Without talking about myself, I like the idea of humility, and I like the idea of going through things where you could be defensive and you could construct a story about, you just screwed up, but you want to play it off like Pee Wee Herman, like I meant to do that, get kind of, but it's almost in a sadistic way, it's more fun, or masochistic way I should say, it's more fun to humiliate yourself and just say, oh my god, I screwed up and I just stuck my foot in my mouth or I did that. And if you can get comfortable with that, I think, and I don't do it all the time, I pass fail on that a lot, but when I do self um not necessarily self-flagellate, but just get myself out there and I'm saying, oh, I screwed up, and I did something. And it's not necessarily I'm trying to be performative about it, but I'm trying to just humiliate myself to say, you are vulnerable, you do make mistakes. And so in other words, I guess vulnerability can be practiced and exercised. And if it's done authentically, then you can feel it and feel
Mhm.
what it's like to be mortified and embarrassed. And, you say something stupid or you do something. Like I have a couple of different YouTube channels, and sometimes my content, people will, say things and really, not necessarily in the best way. And when I was younger and I didn't have the sort of self-regulation, I'd get into these sparring matches with them, and it's like, you screwed up, whatever. They called you out, but they didn't do it in a very nice way. But because I have a channel on horticulture and botany, and it's like you get people who are nerdier than you that want to correct you on things, and some people do it really nicely and elegantly, and it's like, well, according to so and so, this is really what this is, and other people are really kind of obnoxious about it, and I wouldn't handle the obnoxious feedback very well. And so I've learned to realize that I'm flawed and I make mistakes, and I can embarrass myself and stick my foot in my mouth or create faux pas or things like that. And
Mhm.
just in my own experience, I think when my ego's not fully raging and in charge, that I can own that humility and own that embarrassment and feel better about it. Like, oh, somebody corrected me and I'm not going to push back on it. I'm going to humbly take the criticism, even if it wasn't delivered in the most elegant manner, and move on. So anyway, I'm rambling, but
Yeah.
just an
Well, what you're
example.
speaking to is a concept that was developed by Dr. Kristen Neff, and
Mm,
she is the guru of self-compassion,
okay.
and it's called common humanity, basically, right? Like, I am imperfect, like everyone else out there. I made a mistake today. That is, we all make mistakes. And this experience of common humanity allows you to forgive yourself and have compassion for yourself instead of rigidly adhering to those, perfectionism standards that
Mm,
are not authentic and that don't really leave a lot of space for vulnerability, right?
okay. Yeah.
And so when you can have greater self-compassion, you can build that muscle to have greater compassion for others as well. And that helps the world go around in a kinder, more honest, more loving way, basically.
Absolutely, for certain. And in one of your talks, you had mentioned the idea of Wabi-Sabi, and so that's another one to look at. Is like, I'm a cracked face, and it's okay.
Yeah.
I
And
got my gold, my
not only
paint.
am I cracked, but I'm intentionally filling my own cracks with gold.
Yeah, exactly.
Gold. It's like, Leonard Cohen's song lyric that the cracks are where the light comes in.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and again, it's so liberating to just it. You don't have to make a big spectacle of it, but just these little smaller meso-scaled experiences of being wrong or making a mistake, or and then just saying in front of others, I did make a mistake, or I did speak I could have said something better, or I was insensitive, and that's a big thing right now. I mean, we see in the social justice sphere of our society that there are a lot of good opportunities to not be so insensitive, or to think before you say something. Because I'm older and I come from a generation or a time in 40 years ago or 35 years ago where we said things, and now I see the wisdom. And sort of sometimes there's people who get carried away with the shaming and the calling out and things like that. But at the same time, I think the ground floor premise of the idea that we need to be a little more sensitive to others, and in doing that, we also have to check in with ourselves on that too, I think. So I try to practice sensitivity, and I also try to be sensitive to my own self, because I can be the worst person to self-deprecate and yell and scream at myself. More Irish humor than anything. But yeah, so you have to sort of strike that balance of how you interact with others, and then how you interact with the self that is you, and all of your shortcomings and your vulnerabilities and whatever you want to call them, that manifest themselves almost daily. For me, it's daily, especially as I get into middle age. I'm like, oh, I just screwed up again.
Yeah. And what you're speaking to is attunement.
Okay.
Attunement, we can attune to ourselves. Attunement is basically just paying attention and listening to what's actually there, connecting. So you can self-attune and you can attune externally. We have mirror neurons, which are brain cells that are actually empathy neurons that are focused outward facing toward other people. This is what helps us understand, oh, that person seems really sad, so I should probably try to find empathy or compassion or sympathy in response to them. Because if they're really sad and I'm like, hey, you look great, it's misattuned.
Okay.
Right. So if somebody seems really sad and I say, hey, what's going on? That's because my mirror neurons told me that I need to respond in some way. This is what keeps the continuation of the human species alive, because we need connection in order to stay safe. We were not given teeth and claws and fur like other animals. We were given each other and our big brains. And because of our big brains and our connection with each other, we need to have these mirror neurons that help us attune, so that we know these kind of social ins and outs, so that we can protect each other, we can stay safe, and together as community, we can thrive. Right. So speaking to attunement when you talk about that.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes absolute sense. Believe it or not, we've been talking for an hour, and I know we kind of set that as a general area around an hour. So I want to ask you perhaps one more thing, and it ties into authenticity and what you were saying earlier about selling ourselves out, or coming up short, or people pleasing, and all of that. And so let's talk about boundary setting as sort of our last grand topic or bullet point for this conversation. And with you having mentioned that you're publishing a book, I know I'm definitely going to ask you to come back when that comes out. Maybe we can time it with the release of the book, and we can just sort of pick up where we left off, but I'll have researched your book, and then we can carry on from there. But so let's talk about that as a way to put a stop on this dialogue, and then like I said, down the road we'll definitely catch back up with each other. So boundary setting.
Yes. So when I teach boundary work, I teach that there are 3 gates that you must pass through when setting boundaries if they're going to be laid effectively. And it comes with the caveat that you can lay the perfect boundaries that pass through all 3 gates, and it does not guarantee that the person that you're setting the boundary with is going to like it. So this is for you to know that you have done boundaries in a healthy way. Their response to your boundaries is not your responsibility if you pass through these 3 gates. So the 3 gates are respect, kindness, and honesty. Now, if you say your boundary, so say you have somebody who they keep asking you to do something that you don't want to do. So instead of saying like, hell no, I hate you, stop asking, that's like a disrespectful way to set a boundary. You're going to get your message across, but it might be hurtful and it'll be perceived as cruel. But if you say with respect that you don't want to do this thing, you understand that they want you to, right? And with kindness, you're not going to be name calling. You're not going to be mean about it. You're just going to be clear. And then with honesty, this is how I truly feel, right? Then you lay your boundary. They can be mad. They can be disappointed. they get to feel any way that they feel. That is their right as an independent person.
Mm-hmm.
You know that if you are kind, respectful, and honest, that you did everything in your power to set a healthy boundary. And we need boundaries so that we know where I end and where you begin, so
Mm-hmm.
that we can have a healthy maintenance of our internal system without being overstimulated, without being drained, feeling taken advantage of, self-abandoning. There are a lot of things that happen when we don't have boundaries, where we're too porous. And there's also a lot of things that can happen when we're too rigid and we have too many boundaries and we're not flexible, where we cut ourselves off, we get isolated, we feel really insecure. We build narratives that basically separate us rather than connect us. So there's a sweet spot where you're setting the boundaries that feel important to you, and you're also being flexible and fluid in the areas that you feel you can. And it's just really important with boundary setting that you're not attached to the other person's experience of your boundary. You're only setting a boundary from the place of me. This is what I need. And I'm setting it with kindness, respect, and honesty.
Okay. That's all very grounded. I like that. And I like the fact that, like you said, there's a sweet spot. And I'll throw this out as a random thought. We live in an increasingly binary society, and I think it's the machines that we interact with. So machines are all algorithmic, and they're all digital, on off, and I almost think it's having this influence on us, right? So we tend to think of things in sort of on off kind of scenarios, and the algorithms that are formed by that. But like you said, there's nuance, and so finding the middle, understanding that if there's polarity, there's fluidity with. So it's the law of excluded middle. Like there is a middle. You can't deny that. So I think that's something that hopefully won't get too lost on upcoming generations, that there is nuance, there's subtlety, and nothing has to be on a dipole necessarily. If we do know the extremes, that we also know, like you said, there's that sweet spot there. And so that in itself is almost this art that has to be maintained, or a discipline, I guess, that has to be maintained in any relational interface with reality and life and people and events and things like that. So that you emphasize that is, I think, critical, that we know that, because like you said, you don't want to be a hardline jerk, and you don't want to be a doormat either, when you're setting your boundaries, or at least a better, more refined doormat, so that only certain feet can walk across here. Get in the center. Yeah, you're not a doormat, and you're not a jerk.
And it connects too with that second pillar of the radiant life, which is aligned relationships. Because if you are in a relationship that is misaligned, you're going to know it, because your boundaries are not being respected. When you say no, or when you try to just gently, give nonverbal cues that this isn't good for you, and people either disregard it or they just steamroll right past it, that is valuable information, and you want to know that that person is misaligned for you. And that's usually the indication that something needs to change. Whereas if you're in an aligned relationship and you say, that really doesn't feel good for me, thanks for inviting me, but I'm going to pass. And they say, great, I'm glad that you told me. They not only do they tolerate your boundaries, but they respect and they appreciate your boundaries. That's an indication of an aligned relationship. And then if you have an issue down the road where there's some contention in that relationship, setting a boundary will provide you an opportunity to actually create repair with a person like that. Whereas a person who steamrolls your boundaries and doesn't respect them, there's probably not a great chance for repair when something goes wrong, because they're already not respecting what matters to you, right? So boundaries are a great way to indicate the alignment of a relationship. That
makes sense. Yes, indeed. And I suspect in your 15 years as a therapist and counselor that, there's a phenomena of transference and things like that you guys have to deal with. And so you are probably quite the sage when it comes to recognizing boundary crossing, and even with like smarter manipulative people, like boundary and, insertion, where maybe kind of surreptitious, like it's not above the radar necessarily. So I imagine you've developed quite the skill, just like a childcare worker develops an immune system from hell because they've been exposed to every virus that's ever existed. And give me what you got. Anybody that ever works with children in daycare or pediatrics or whatever, I think you maybe have developed that kind of that sensibility, right? And hopefully I'm intuiting that correctly, that
Mhm.
you've come across a lot of people in novelty and human expression. And so I would imagine that you have a quite a honed sense of that dance of boundaries and relationships and dealing with people, and recognizing patterns and behaviors and things like that.
I think so. And I
Okay.
think what's been valuable is that really learning that from my work has created an overflow effect into my personal life so that I can create boundaries with family members, with friends, with people in the same way. So it still feels authentic to me.
Okay.
But that is how I learned those three gates of kindness, respect, and honesty. Because in the beginning, when I was just like exploring boundary work, I didn't always do it so kindly. Sometimes it was a door slam, or sometimes it wasn't as honest as it could have been. And so I learned through experience, because I really walk my own talk in my therapy work. I do all the things I ask my clients to do, and I'm on the personal growth journey as well. And so I learned through experience that kindness, honesty, and respect are the way to set boundaries. Otherwise, you feel icky, right? The boundary still gets set, but it doesn't feel good. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a better way, to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. Both personally and professionally, I suspect. Uh,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. It's
I
the same. They're just other people, right?
right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And hurt feelings are hurt feelings, and yeah.
Yeah. And you can also set boundaries with yourself.
Mm,
Right. That's important too, where you say, like, look, every time I do this thing, I don't feel good. So I'm not going to do that thing anymore. And I'm going to
mm,
hold myself accountable for it. Right. And then if you slip up and you do the thing and you feel badly about it, then you get to practice self-compassion and
mm.
forgiveness. And you get to say, all right, see, it happened again. Now are we going to respect our own boundary? Every
Yeah.
time we eat that sugar thing, we don't feel well, like
Yeah.
drink that alcohol thing, whatever it is. Like,
Right. Right.
boundaries
Yeah.
are, they're internal, they're external, they're communal, they're societal. They're just really they're an important facet of being a person.
Hmm. Yeah, it's iterative for sure. Kate, this has been a wonderful conversation. And again, researching your work, I learned some new things, and was impressed with the composite system that you have. It is sort of made up of different approaches and ideas and thoughts, and I think it's really remarkable. And so, to those of you, and I always joke at the end of every conversation that, because I look at my analytics and I get about 10% retention after about an hour. So those 10%ers out there, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as passive observers. If you have any questions for Kate, you can, again, you can access Kate directly through the links that are down below in the description field. You can leave a comment on this conversation. I'm happy to CC it over to Kate, or to copy paste it over to Kate. But yeah, she's accessible, and I would again highly recommend that you explore her work and become more familiar with it. And again, Kate, this has been a really fruitful conversation. It's been informative, and I've been positively impressed by, again, the work that you do in both talking with you now and doing the research. So I thank you for coming on and having a talk with me. And I'm already looking forward to the next one, because your book coming out, like you said, it was a great way to put it. It was a download, and it needs to be present in the world now. Any sort of proactive, pro-social, positive valence tools and utilities that we can bring forward, I think is great, because some folks, I think COVID was a real litmus test for our resiliency and our resolve, and some folks are still processing that. And there's all kinds of other pressures going on. And I think, anything that we can bring out that is solution oriented, that's there to help guide us, is well worth the effort and very necessary at the time. So thank you for your project.
You're
And
welcome. Thank you for the talk.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, YouTube audience, thank you guys. Those of you who are still watching, I appreciate your presence. And again, you can communicate either to Kate through direct access through the links or through comments, and make sure that she gets those. So thank you for your attendance. I very much appreciate it. Kate, I'll say goodbye to you after we're done recording, and may this conversation go forth into the world, have legs, become its own little thing, and impact people's lives. I hope for that. So, all right, take care, YouTube people. Thank you so much.